Raising Kael. Interview by Hollis. Interview, really. Raising Kael by Hollis Alpert, 1971, from the Saturday Review, April 24th, 1971. If anyone should ever do a study of film criticism in America, the month of February 1971 undoubtedly will take on historic significance, for that was the month that John Simon and Andrew Sarris traded swings at each other in the drama section of the Sunday New York Times. Readers responded pro or con, or anti-both, and Pauline Kael's long essay, Raising Cain, took up most of two successive issues of The New Yorker. In a curious way, the events were related. The quarrel between Simon and Sarris basically had to do with the validity of the auteur theory of film criticism. Miss Kael's study of the origins of that landmark of American cinema, Citizen Kane, had considerable bearing on the argument. The ramifications of the theory are too Byzantine to be discussed here, nor is Sarris to be held responsible for all the interpretations and misinterpretations of his notable field work. Enough, one hopes, merely to say that the auteur theory has helped make the film director into a figure of cultish hero worship. Since Orson Welles rates high in the auteur rankings, Miss Kael's essay exploded among autorial circles and film buffs generally like a dynamite blast in the halls of the U.S. Senate. Welles, her essay made clear, was not the sole creative force behind Citizen Kane, and it strongly implied that the stout prodigy had, over the years, acquired a lot of the credit and glory that by rights should have gone to a Hollywood screenwriter, long dead, by the name of Herman J. Mankiewicz. Her research led her to the conclusion that Mankiewicz, the older brother of director Joseph L., was the initiator of the groundbreaking film, and at the very least an important participant in its creation. None of this could have been expected to go down nicely with Welles' adherents, and a counterattack is said to be brewing. Sarris, for one, feels that her interpretation of certain facts is questionable. He also reports that Peter Bogdanovich, a filmmaker and cineast who is preparing a book on Welles, with the collaboration of the master himself, is violently opposed to Miss Kael's conclusions. But for those who have managed to stay aloof from the critical wars, Miss Kael's 50,000-word essay is an uncommonly fascinating piece of film scholarship, a compendium of nostalgic gossip and a suspenseful intellectual narrative that, for at least one reader among the hundreds who have written her, is an elegant thriller. What she has also done is to raise the sadly neglected ghost of Herman Mankiewicz, turn him into one of the most interesting people ever met, and restore him to his deservedly high place in film history. How all this happened to come about is a story in itself, one of its oddest quirks being that Miss Kael never intended to write it. Who exactly is Pauline Kael, and what makes her write so long and well? Dispersed throughout her 3 books of film criticism are little tidbits of autobiography, and perhaps we can connect them with some help from the lady herself. One thing she makes no bones about is her age. She is 51 and sees no reason to hide the fact. "I don't know any way," she says, "to discuss the movies you saw when you were young if you conceal your age. And I don't know why women have to be so hung up about age anyway." So, she was born in 1919 in the town of Turok, California, some 30 miles north of San Francisco. Her father, a rancher, moved his brood of 5 children, she was the youngest, to San Francisco, where she attended local schools, then moved on to the University of California at Berkeley. She majored in philosophy, read voraciously, and gobbled up movies, although in those days she had no idea of her eventual vocation. She was, however, interested in writing, and tried plays, film scripts, and literary essays. I had no money, she says. In the East, people know how to get started in a career, whereas in the West you simply try to write. She wrote and had a crazy quilt variety of jobs. She set up an art book department in a San Francisco department store, sold books, worked at Houghton Mifflin's San Francisco branch office, assisted with the making of experimental films, and for 2 years worked at home as a seamstress, putting in hems and shortening men's pants. The reason that she had to work at home, and, as she puts it, had so many crazy jobs, was the serious illness of her daughter, Gina, who could not be left unattended. An operation restored Gina's health, and the two now share an apartment on Central Park West in New York, with a dog and a cat. Pauline Kael's first published writing in San Francisco's City Lights was, as it happened, an essay on movies. She also began doing broadcasts on movies for KPFA, the Pacifica Foundation station in Berkeley, and soon developed a following. One listener, a man who owned a movie house in Berkeley, wrote her he was having a rough time with the theater, and she began the programming and managing of it. Once under her wing, not only did the theater become a phenomenally successful operation, but it became 2 theaters. So many were turned away that a second room was opened. The Cinema Guild and Studio became the models on which others have since based their twin art houses. In addition to selecting the programs on what might be called eclectic principles, she wrote the program notes to fit exactly the space for each film on the monthly calendar she printed. Herewith a sample of early Kael. Quote, Bringing Up Baby. Katharine Hepburn's first comedy, made in 1938, rescued her from the tremulous anguish in crinoline which had made her one of Hollywood's surest guarantees of financial disaster. Lunatic comedy of the 30s generally started with an heiress. This one starts with an heiress, Hepburn, who has a dog and a leopard called Baby. Cary Grant is a paleontologist who has just acquired the bone he needs to complete his dinosaur skeleton. Grant, Cary, winds up with Hepburn, and no paleontologist ever got hold of a more beautiful set of bones. End quote. In 1961, she went back on to her radio reviewing, and some of these broadcasts were reprinted in Film Quarterly, a West Coast publication that brought her to the attention of East Coast critics, mainly because she often took issue with their judgments. People have used this against me in a funny way, she says now, as though I were doing it out of spitefulness. But out west, when we got the movies, they'd already been reviewed in the Eastern press, and everyone was seeing them in terms of a sort of impacted New York opinion, which was largely Bosley Crowther's, and movies he hadn't liked nobody went to see. And so in order to try for a fresh approach to certain movies, I tried to clear away the Eastern view, my aim being for people to look at movies somewhat differently than the delivered dicta. People insistently misunderstand this, as though you go out of your way to pan your colleagues. She came to New York in 1965, and her first job was for Life magazine. That year was the first in which she managed to make a living as a film critic, a big help being the success of her first collection, I Lost It at the Movies. Life also commissioned her to do a long study of the making of The Group, a film based on Mary McCarthy's novel. She turned in a brilliant 25,000 words, and Life turned it down. Being Pauline Kael, she now realized was becoming perilous. Work with Atlantic, Vogue, and McCall's followed. When she and McCall's parted company because of editorial disagreement, she moved on again, this time to the New Republic, replacing Stanley Kaufman, who had gone to the New York Times as its drama critic. She was hardly happy at the New Republic. The editor, she says, would cut her copy without consulting her, and sometimes wouldn't use it at all. I quit the magazine in some despair, she said, and had no idea what to do. I had come to the conclusion that it was just about impossible making a living as a movie critic. I was lying in bed with the flu. I was busted when a telephone call came from William Shawn of The New Yorker. The call from Shawn came, much like an episode in The Perils of Pauline, in the nick of time. The movie spot on The New Yorker, he told her, was open because Brendan Gill was taking on the theater column. Would she consider sharing it on a 6-month basis each with Penelope Gilliatt? I didn't at all mind, she said, and it's worked out ever since. About 2.5 years ago, Mark Jaffe, the editor of Bantam Books, asked her to do a brief introduction for a paperback edition of the script of Citizen Kane. The firm had acquired publication rights from RKO and Orson Welles. Miss Kael declined on the grounds that she had, the year before, written a long piece on Orson Welles. She recommended someone else. Months went by, and the writer she had recommended failed to come up with anything. So I said I would do it. There were other directors I would have rather studied, Renoir, for instance, but when I got involved in it, I became really interested. The Hearst material I was already familiar with, but because my job was to introduce the script, I started investigating the writing, and that took me into the whole role of the writer in filmmaking. From being absorbed in the project, it became a kind of madness, made all the more strange because I was giving months and months of time to something I couldn't make any money on. In fact, I soon dissipated the fee for the job, $750, just on telephone calls. The passages in Raising Cain that have caused the most furor in movie circles have to do with the diminution of the Welles role in the writing of the script. Not only did he not write it, she makes clear, he didn't even think of the idea. She quotes the secretary who was present throughout and typed each draft. Welles didn't write or dictate one line of the shooting script of Citizen Kane. Welles, wrongly or rightly, has won only one Academy Award, and that was for his co-authorship of the famous film. Miss Kael adds, under the present rules of the Guild for script credit, Welles's name probably would not have appeared. But she goes further. Even that vaunted style of the film, which has so impressed succeeding directors and critics everywhere, she traces not to Welles, but to his cameraman, the late Greg Toland. While I talked with her, she suddenly showed me some stills and asked me which film I thought they had come from. They looked as though they might have come from Citizen Kane, but they were stills of an earlier film, Mad Love, photographed by Greg Toland. Here, then, was strong evidence for what many have long suspected, that neither authorship nor credit has been fairly apportioned, more often than not, in the film world. And it is not merely a matter of personal vanity. Audiences are being cheated when talents are robbed of their just recognition, for the opportunity to continue working in film often depends on that recognition. Directors, aided and abetted by film historians and critics, and by their own publicity, have emphasized themselves as the primary creative force in filmmaking. Sometimes this is, of course, true. On the other hand, if one adopted the auteur-director point of view, one might all too easily assume that all the rest involved, writers, technicians, actors, producers, are merely automata through which the director is expressing himself. Several contemporary directors, misreading Serres, cheerfully espouse his theories, although they hardly apply to them at all. His theory aims mainly at a unified way of looking at films of the 30s and 40s. Nevertheless, Miss Kael is more than anxious to give Welles a great deal of credit for Citizen Kane. The key was Welles, she said. He was the catalyst. He made it possible for so many frustrated Hollywood talents to give of their best. Marvelous as Mankiewicz's script was, the picture might have been an ordinary picture with some other director, and certainly with some other actor as Kane. But it is wrong to think that Welles brought it all out of himself. He brought it out of others also. Her research took her, off and on, close to 2 years. I talked to everyone I thought could help me, she said. But I was very selective about whom I interviewed. Mainly, I guarded against people I felt might be too emotionally involved. She did not talk, for instance, to Herman's younger brother, Joseph L. Mankiewicz. An important clue came from Sam Zolotto, who had been on the Times when Herman Mankiewicz had worked there in the mid-20s. I got a lot of help from the secretary, Mrs. Rita Alexander, who had taken the dictation from Mankiewicz and done the typing from start to finish. It was one of those funny things. It turned out she now lived only 4 blocks from me. One person she did not contact was Wells himself. He has talked about Cain, she said, over the years here and there and in England, and I felt there was nothing to talk about with him. I know what he has to say. Once into the writing, she knew she was going far beyond her original assignment from Mark Jaffe, who informed her that her contract allowed her to retain magazine rights. About 75 pages into it, I wanted to see if the New Yorker would be interested in publishing it, and I went to see William Shawn and asked him if he would like to read some of what I was doing. I handed him the 75 pages, and he asked me to sit down, and he started reading it. After 20 pages, he looked up, said, "I'm buying it," and then went on while I sat there. Jaffe, with an important script and an important essay on it in hand, then argued for Atlantic Little, Brown, to bring out a hardcover edition, to be published in September, at which time the fuss over Raising Cain should become louder and more furious. A good deal of the currently intense interest in the film criticism is due to this same dedicated lady, who feels that movies are worth as much time and attention as any art form that involves the emotions and minds of people and affects their lives. With no stipulation on the length of what she writes for the New Yorker, she has been able to go into the kind of careful analysis she feels is her forte as a writer on film. But people, she said, constantly refer to film criticism as though it were new. There was tremendous interest in Edgy's criticism, and people read Otis Ferguson back in the 30s. Since she makes it a point of seeing 6 or 7 films a week, her own writing is often done in the late hours. She does it in longhand, scribbling away sometimes until dawn breaks over Central Park. She has never learned to type. The best Christmas gift she ever got was when her daughter announced to her that she had secretly learned to type and would henceforth do her typing. While some unhappy filmmakers call her venomous, and reviewers will occasionally refer to her work as bitchy, a description conveniently applicable to the writings of a woman, she feels it would be callous and stupid to neglect the evidence of her eyes and ears. People talk about how great movies are, she said, and they never go to them. It's a minority audience now, and that minority seldom sees more than 6 movies a year. She can be as formidable in person as in her writing. The filmmaker who tangles with her had best have strong defensive positions. Those who happened to be present when she and Norman Mailer discussed his films were treated to a rare example of intellectual infighting. Women's lib is not a subject that interests her, nor are other women's organizations. I love what I'm doing. If there is a question most often asked her by those she meets, it is the meaning of her title, I Lost It at the Movies. What, I once asked her, did you lose at the movies? I treasure the answer she gave me. Oh, she said with a sigh, there are so many kinds of innocence to be lost at the movies. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe and comment, and I guess that's all. Thank you.